All right, so let me preface my remarks a little bit. I'm not going to be anachronistic, but I am going to use the title of a shout out for Franciscan personalism. But that's because I'm going to understand Franciscanism to be a school of thought, and I'm going to understand personalism to be a kind of movement. So think of it that way. And I want to talk about the symbiosis that these two, that this movement and this school can have for each other. So I think there's certain benefits that could accrue, and I hope that through my discussion that we'll see how some of these can emerge, and hopefully we can talk about them more, and at least it will become interesting for us for the future. So some of the benefits I see for this symbiosis are a benefit for personalism would, in symbiosis with the Franciscan tradition, is a profound and deeply metaphysical and theological school in which to put personalism. So it can provide what I think are some deep metaphysical taproots. A benefit for Franciscanism, which I think today is, in some senses, a largely lost intellectual tradition. I think it will, by being in contact with personalism, will come in contact with live and vibrant philosophical, theological, and cultural issues of our time, the things that personalists are interested in. So I see a benefit for this union here. And I think on top of that, we can restore a proper pluralism to the Catholic intellectual tradition in particular, and to the Western tradition more broadly. So if you look at my handouts that I gave, there's one with a picture of two fellows next to each other with like a wing sticking out from them. So this is my representation of, I think, a good kind of pluralism within the Catholic intellectual tradition, but representing more broadly the Western tradition. So on the left-hand side, you have Thomas Aquinas, and above him is the Eucharist in the clouds. And on the right-hand side, you have Scotus, and above him is Our Lady in the clouds. And you have this title in the middle, Collationes, there. So this is from a manuscript from Jerome de Montefortino's work, in which he tried to synthesize Thomas Aquinas and Scotus as much as possible. And when we do that, we realize, of course, where they disagree, but more importantly, we realize where they agree. And so where they agree is sort of, I think, of the heart of the Catholic intellectual tradition. There's interesting differences. But we need to recognize the correct pluralism, or else we can get into certain problems. And so to illustrate the problems, I wanted to share with you a certain character that some of you may have run into before. It's not a Thomist, right? But it's a Thomer, okay? A Thomer is a person who doesn't have philosophy, right? They use Thomism or the things they've learned about Thomas as an ideology, right? It's, to them, they're interested in Thomas as providing dogmas and creeds for them to believe in, rather than a system of thought. So they approach Thomism in a radically different way than St. Thomas himself would approach it. So we want to avoid being a Thomer, and we want to be a good Thomist, right? And a good Thomist, the ones I've talked to, are very excited about what Scotus has to say, are very excited to compare what he thinks with what they think. And I think the same sort of thing can be done with phenomenology and Thomism, or phenomenology and Franciscanism, personalism, et cetera. I think this sort of pluralism creates a vibrant argument, right? And I think of a tradition, the way MacIntyre defined it, was an ongoing argument. And where these figures can all argue, there's certain shared assumptions, and those are really important assumptions. Okay, so that's why I'm interested in doing this sort of symbiosis project. So I want to start out by reading to you from a document by a transhumanist, if any of you have ever heard of that. I heard recently that Oxford University just got the largest grant in history to work on artificial intelligence. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, so check out what this transhumanist named Nick Bostrom says about transhumanism, and that will give you an idea of, one, where our culture is at, because he's at Oxford University, which is where Scotus studied. And this is something that people are interested in. It's a live idea to a lot of people. Okay? And it's the same sort of ideas, let's say, Lewis was talking about in The Abolition of Man, if you've ever read that. So what is transhumanism? This is what Nick Bostrom says. Transhumanism is a loosely defined movement that has developed gradually over the past 2 decades. It promotes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding and evaluating the opportunities for enhancing the human condition and the human organism opened up by the advancement of technology. Not necessarily a problem, but let's keep going. Attention is given to both present technologies like genetic engineering and information technology, and anticipated future ones such as molecular nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. The enhancement options being discussed include radical extension of human health span, eradication of disease, elimination of unnecessary suffering, and augmentation of human intellectual, physical, and emotional capacities. Now you're getting the idea of why it's transhumanist. Other transhumanist themes include space colonization and the possibility of creating super intelligent machines, along with other potential developments that could profoundly alter the human condition. The ambit is not limited to gadgets and medicine, but encompasses also economic, social, institutional designs, cultural development, and psychological skills and techniques. Transhumanists view human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the endpoint of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings have. Okay? This is what people actually believe in this movement. This movement is the exact opposite of personalism. Okay? Personalism stands against these sorts of things. Okay? So I understand personalism to be or at least one aspect of it, to attempt to restore human beings as they are in nature and human society and the dignity of man in light of the dehumanizing anti-cultures that have been steadily growing over the last 200 years, typified by the horrors of the 20th century, totalitarianism, fascism, communism, but also, as so many papal encyclicals present it, the culture of death, the moral decay, the loss of virtue, the loss of civics, atheism, exploitation, identity confusion, and the rest. Personalism is not merely a metaphysical theory that human beings can survive death and that we have immortal souls, that Cartesianism is a distortion on the one hand and materialism is a distortion on the other hand. It's much more than a metaphysics of the human person. I understand the heart of personalism to be about humanizing ourselves, right? Not transhumanizing ourselves and our communities, our cultures, and indeed especially our Western civilization, which has grown in some senses corrupt and ossified as the Roman culture that it once transformed was. So personalism I understand to be a movement, and what do I understand Franciscanism to be? So I want to start out understanding Franciscanism by reading this poem in your handout by Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was directly inspired and revered Blessed John Duns Scotus. And this poem, in some senses, I think, captures both personalist themes of profound importance and Franciscan, specifically Scotistic themes of profound importance. And in some senses, this poem represents, as a symbol, everything I believe and I think is important. So here's the poem. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, as tumbled over rim in roundy wells stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung, finds tongue, to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. That's a poem worth contemplating and reading many, 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 many times over and over again and memorizing. I'm too nervous to do it by memory, so I just read it, but I think I have it memorized. At any rate, that's going to be, I think, the sort of symbol of this symbiosis I'm talking about right there. Okay, so to talk about the Franciscan school, I want to first of all say it's a school of thought. It's not identifiable with any single individual. The same goes for Thomism, actually. Even though Thomists are looking at Thomas, there's lots of different Thomisms. It's a school of thought too, all right? So there's flexibility within that. And there's certain figures that become important to the Franciscan tradition, and we can compare it usefully with the Thomistic tradition. So I'd like to highlight what I think of as the three pillars of the Franciscan tradition. The first is St. Francis himself. So St. Francis himself, for the Franciscan school, is himself in his person a theological locus, right? A datum, right, to study. His life itself expresses certain truths about theology that can't necessarily be written out and studied abstractly. But it's a source, you might say. So the theological source isn't just documents and writings, but a person himself. That's how the Franciscans understand St. Francis himself. So he's also sometimes called the Alter Christus, another Christ. Okay? So I want to read a little bit from a great description of St. Francis by G.K. Chesterton, who wrote a biography of St. Francis, a famous one. So he says this in the beginning, and this will be, in certain senses, the foundation of the Franciscan school, this understanding of St. Francis. He says this: the practical reconciliation of the gaiety and austerity that he was talking about, I must leave to the story itself, which he's about to write. But since I have mentioned these figures, Matthew Arnold and Renan, and the rationalistic admirers of St. Francis, I will give here a hint of what seems to be the most advisable for such readers to keep in mind. These distinguished writers found things like the stigmata a stumbling block, because to them a religion was a philosophy, and a philosophy was an impersonal thing. And it is only the most personal passion that provides here an approximate earthly parallel. A man will not roll in the snow for a stream of tendency by which all things fulfill the law of their being. He will not go without food in the name of something not ourselves that makes for righteousness. He will do things like this, or pretty nearly like this, under a quite different impulse. He will do these things when he is in love. The first fact to realize about St. Francis is involved in the first fact with which this story starts. That when he said from the first that he was a troubadour, and said later that he was a troubadour of a newer and nobler romance, he was not using a mere metaphor, but understood himself much better than the scholars understand him. He was, to the last agonies of asceticism, a troubadour. He was a lover. He was a lover of God, and he was really and truly a lover of men, possibly a much rarer mystical vocation. A lover of men is very nearly the opposite of a philanthropist. Indeed, the pedantry of the Greek word carries something like a satire on itself. A philanthropist may be said to love anthropoids, but as St. Francis did not love humanity, he loved men, so also he did not love Christianity, but Christ. Say, if you think so, that he was a lunatic loving an imaginary person, but an imaginary person, not an imaginary idea. And for the modern reader, the clue to the asceticism and all the rest can best be found in the stories of lovers when they seem to be rather like lunatics. Tell it as the tale of one of the troubadours and the wild things he would do for his lady, and the whole of our modern puzzlement disappears. In such a romance, there would be no contradiction between the poet gathering flowers in the sun and enduring a freezing vigil in the snow, between his praising all earthly and bodily beauty and then refusing to eat, between his glorifying gold and purple and perversely going about in rags, between his showing pathetically a hunger for a happy life and a thirst for heroic death. All these riddles would be easily resolved in the simplicity of any noble love. Only this was so noble a love that 9 out of 10 men hardly even heard of it. The reader cannot even begin to see the sense of a story that he may well seem to him a wild one until he understands that to this great mystic, his religion was not a thing like a theory, but it was a thing like a love affair. The figure in the brown habit stands above the hearth in the room where I write, and alone among many such images, at no stage of my pilgrimage has he ever seemed to me stranger. There's something of a harmony between the hearth and the firelight, and my own first pleasure in his words about his brother Fire, for he stands far enough back in my memory to mingle with all those more domestic dreams of the first days. Even the fantastic shadows thrown by the fire make a sort of shadow pantomime that belongs to the nursery. Yet the shadows were even then the shadows of his favorite beasts and birds, as when he saw them, grotesque but haloed with the love of God. His brother Wolf and brother Sheep seemed then almost like Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit of the more Christian Uncle Remus. I have come slowly to see many and more marvelous aspects of such a man, but I've never lost that one. His figure stands on a sort of bridge connecting my boyhood and my conversion to many other things. For the romance of his religion, and it penetrated even the rationalism of my time. Insofar as I've had this experience, I may be able to lead others a little further along the road, but only a little further. Nobody knows better than I do now that it is a road upon which angels might fear to tread, but though I'm certain of failure, I'm not altogether overcome by fear, for he suffered fools gladly. So I'm saying those words as well as I enter into this conversation because I'm not an expert in Franciscan thought at all. I'm a sort of amateur enthusiast. I see its importance and I see its fruitfulness. So that's the first figure, St. Francis himself, pillar of the Franciscan tradition. Well, how do we get from that to a giant system of ideas comparable on the side of Thomas Aquinas with his vast cathedral of ideas? Well, the translator, as some people have called him, the translator of St. Francis' life into a theological and theoretical key is St. Bonaventure. And so St. Bonaventure, we might look at him as, instead of St. Francis seeing love as a primary idea, we can look at St. Bonaventure adding another thing to that, is wisdom. He emphasized sapientia over scientia, and that has to do with his deep understanding of the human person, the destiny of God, and other things that I don't want to get into too many details about, but I'm painting a big picture here to begin with. But then we look at Scotus, and I think Scotus is the third pillar that is often misunderstood. And a lot of the scholars who write about Scotus these days often talk about how there's sort of a balderdash meta-narrative about Scotus, right? That he's sort of the leader to modernism. He's the granddaddy of Kant, right? He's the source of all the modern errors that have infected the Catholic culture, right? And he's sort of thrown under the bus. He led in Occam and nominalism and Luther and all this other stuff that is supposed to be a big complaint. And I think that the scholars who have actually started looking at Scotus, right, since the neo-scholastic revival, and especially in the last half of the 20th century anyway, have said that's all basically balderdash. So what is Scotus as the church has understood Scotus? Scotus is, first of all, a blessed, right? Second of all, Scotus is, his name isn't just subtle doctor, but Marian doctor. So I want to look at his theological ideas in just a second. But he's called the perfecter of Bonaventure. So here we have a connection between these three pillars. We have St. Francis, we have the translator of St. Francis into an academic theological sort of key in St. Bonaventure himself. And then we have the perfecter of Bonaventure, which is a term that one of the popes gave to Scotus in a document about his beatification. So what do I want to say about Scotus in particular? I want to focus on Scotus's doctrine of will and morality. Scotus has an entire, you might say, alternate cathedral alongside of Aquinas. And there's every element of philosophy, any branch of the subject, he has something interesting and unique to say that you can put into dialogue with other figures. But I want to focus on just his doctrines of will and morality because I think they have a special synergy with the personalists especially with von Hildebrand. So first of all, I want to talk about Scotus on will as the only rational power. So in your reader, the first reading, Scotus in the selection that you were given is commenting on Aristotle's metaphysics, and he asks the question, is the difference that Aristotle assigns between the rational and irrational potencies appropriate? Namely, the former are capable of contrary effects, and the latter produce but one effect. That sounds abstract and really boring, right? But when you think about what that really means, right, he's making a fundamental division in the nature of reality between will, rational potency, right, and irrational potency, nature, right? And wills don't come without intellects, and intellects and wills, right, those are persons. So we have a fundamental division in reality between person and nature. And that division, Scotus argues in this scholastic way, right, is exhaustive and basic between those two active potencies. And I want to emphasize that for Scotus, the will is an active power, an active potency. And he says here, to contrary effects. So here's Scotus's understanding, at least in one element, of the freedom of the will. The freedom of the will is what sets it apart from all nature. It's unique, it's different, it's interesting, and he's got a profound analysis of the metaphysics of that I'm not going to go into, but I just want to mention it here as a conversation point. So this distinction, he says, is that the will is the truly rational power. In fact, he says in these passages that the intellect, right, is not a rational power, right? The intellect is a natural power, right? Because it can't produce contrary effects. In other words, it doesn't have freedom innate in it. Now, the next idea that I had in the reader was the doctrine of the two affections of the will, which Scotus gets from St. Anselm. And those two affections are how he positively explains this freedom that he just mentioned in a really abstract metaphysical way, right? Which is the power for opposites at one and the same time. Another name for that I should mention, which would be a discussion point, would be the idea of synchronic contingency. Okay? So in this contrasts in marked ways with Aristotle's understanding of contingency and the will. Okay, so the twofold inclination of the will. So this is Scotus trying to explain in a positive way what he calls the native freedom or the congenital freedom of the will is an interplay between these two affections. The will has a complex structure. So one of the affections is called the affection for justice, where the will has a natural tendency or inclination to love justice for the sake of justice, right? In a certain way, it's not for the sake of the individual nature, but just for the sake of justice itself, what von Hildebrand would call the intrinsic good, intrinsic value. And the second inclination is the more familiar sort that we think of from Aristotle, which is the inclination, and Scotus calls it here, the affection for the advantageous, or the affectio commodi, right? It's the inclination of a nature to perfect itself, okay? So that would where we think of the idea of eudaimonism and the Aristotelian understanding of virtues fits into that inclination. But Scotus has this other inclination that's combined with it. And he understands that other inclination, the affection for justice, to be the innate freedom of the will, because it can restrain the affection for the commodious or the affection for the advantage, self-perfection. If we let self-perfection go to without being checked, without a check rein, as Scotus calls it, then we have a very suitable way to explain the fall of Satan, which is what Anselm did, right? And Scotus follows that understanding, which is where this distinction comes from, Anselm's discussion of the fall of Satan, these two distinctions. So the next element of the will I want to just mention briefly is the idea of the will as an effective center. And we see Scotus in the reader that I gave you directly citing Augustine, and the passages that he cited, I provided references to those citations, where Augustine says that the will has its own affections in it. So it's part of the will to have, you might say, emotions, right, are internal to the will. Emotions aren't just sensible fluctuations in your body, right? They're in your actual will. So the will has two affections, two inclinations that have a complex interplay, and then there's this affective dimension to the will itself. So the will is this super complex reality. And then what I want to say about that will is I gave that other picture there of Dante's Inferno, because Scotus explicitly follows Augustine there, where Augustine understands virtue as the order of love, which is something that von Hildebrand also does. And Dante was a third order Franciscan. We often hear, well, he was, he was really interested in Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, which he was, but he was also a third order Franciscan. And in the structure of hell you see there, I wrote in the side column there how each level of hell for Dante is related to love in a certain way. So the higher levels of hell, which you might say aren't as hellish, they are love in excess, right, or self-gratification. If you start going down lower into hell where it gets more hellish and worse, right, those are called love disordered. So the first is just sort of excess love, lust and gluttony, stuff like that. Then we have love disordered, starting to get a little bit worse. And then at the very bottom, the worst sins, which are all listed there in Dante's Inferno, is love perverted, love turned against itself, right? The worst kinds of things, right, are betrayal, okay? So that's just an example of a third order Franciscan using the Ordo Amoris in a very profound work of imagination that represents the Christian soul in the journey to God. Okay. The last thing I want to mention is Scotus's definition of moral goodness, which was in your reader. And there Scotus defines moral goodness in a way that's directly comparable to the idea of beauty. And I think this is highly significant. One thing we can compare this with is C.S. Lewis's description of the Tao. How am I doing for time?
Minutes.
Okay. So C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man describes the Tao as the intrinsic intelligibility of reality itself, and the purpose of true education, which is what The Abolition of Man is about if you look at the subtitle, is being able to be in harmony with this intelligible reality. And it needs a certain amount of training. We need a certain amount of training when we're children, when we're growing up, or else we can't see, right, the moral realities that are in nature, in reality itself. So we have to get the right affections. We have to get the right desires. So here is I put an emphasis on the priority of will. Your will has to be in order, or else you can't see things straight. And our will is radically dependent on other people, right? If we didn't have a good upbringing, right, we might not be able to see the moral facts. Aristotle agrees with this as well. So we have morality compared to beauty. And so I want to end with that thought and connect it to the previous talk that I gave where Socrates is admonishing Callicles for not having self-control and not understanding how the virtues, the four cardinal virtues, relate to the blessed life. And he says, the problem with you, Callicles, is that you neglect geometry. So here we have the Tao, and the idea of moral beauty is that idea of not neglecting geometry, which is exactly what Plato's Academy says on its inscription on the top of it. It says, you can't come in here if you're ignorant of geometry, right? You're not going to learn anything, right? So you have to already be attuned to the intelligibility of reality. In other words, you have to see the meaning and the beauty that's already in there. And I think that when we understand morality that way, we can understand the dimensions of that we often forget in this age of scientism and a sort of cold rationality that doesn't have a personal dimension to it. So I think I want to stop there. I just want to put those ideas on the table and hope that we can have further discussion about some of those things. There's a lot of depth to go in each of those ideas, but I wanted to put them on the table for you as items of discussion and points of departure.
It's a difficult task in how many minutes to present the philosophy of virtue of Hildebrand. Perhaps the best starting point is to say that his philosophy of virtue deals with virtues as one kind of intentional act. And Hildebrand, an intentional act is an act that is consciously directed at some object. It's a concept in scholastic philosophy and then again in Franz Brentano and Husserl. It means an act that has this kind of amazing quality that the conscious act is not just a state like tiredness, but is directed at some kind of object that stands over against the act and of which we have consciousness. And within these intentional acts, Hildebrand distinguishes cognitive acts, which are characterized through some receptivity and transcendence. In these acts, the object speaks to us, discloses itself to us, we understand it, we know it, or get to know it, and what he calls responses. And the response is an act that an intentional act that somehow is the opposite direction of intentionality from the subject to the object. It's like a stance or a response of the person to an object. And within these acts, responding acts, Hildebrand distinguishes theoretical responses, that is, intellectual responses such as conviction, and volitional responses, and affective responses. And one might say that his philosophy of virtue deals with virtue as one of the kind of volitional responses, a response that is given to an object by the free will. One may well ask oneself whether he includes in virtue also a possible affective response, especially in the light of his philosophy of love and his philosophy also of caritas, but I will not here at the moment try to answer this question as well. Now, within the volitional responses, Hildebrand distinguishes four kinds, what he calls spheres of morality. In the Ethics, he speaks only of three spheres of morality, but I think if one takes into account his first works, first two ethical works, one can speak of four spheres of free responses that can be morally good or can also be morally bad. The first one that is perhaps most usually dealt with in ethics is the sphere of actions. In the action is characterized by the fact that the person, through his act, brings about or intends to bring about a state of affairs outside of his action. So, for example, feeding the hungry or negatively starving Maximilian Kolbe to death in the concentration camp. These are actions that realize some state of affairs outside of the person. Then second sphere of volitional acts and of responses in general are what we could call inner responses, inner stances to some concrete object which are realized here and now, but they do not aim at a state of affairs outside of the person. So, for example, benevolence of love is such an inner response to the objective good of another person, or envy is a negative inner response also to the objective good for the other person, which we do not benevolently affirm, but rather which upsets us for whatever reason that we cannot here give a whole analysis of envy. I am reminded of one of my first philosophy lectures at the University of Salzburg, where I spoke of love, hatred, envy, and benevolence. And I had a student who came to me, and I had tried to show that envy is a really terrible inner response. And she came to the exam, and she said, but envy is totally normal. When I go on the street and I see a girl who is more beautiful than I, then I want to scratch her face. And, and that is, she presented it as a completely ordinary and good response. So my class failed entirely. So anyway, these are inner responses. They do not directly, well, in her case, it also wanted to give rise to an action to disfigure the face, but as such, envy doesn't have to, can exist inside the person without a direct intention to bring about state of affairs outside the person. And then we can say that within such actual inner responses, or besides such actual inner responses, Hildebrand distinguishes the sphere of virtues or vices. And these virtues or vices are characterized by certain features that are not, or at least not necessarily found in the inner responses. First of all, they are what Hildebrand calls superactual. That is, they have an existence in the person that is not reduced to the time when we actually experience these acts. So, for example, love, we cannot say, well, pain, physical pain, is just real when we actually feel it. When we don't feel it, it is gone. But a love, for example, is an act that exists superactually in the person. That is, that we cannot say I love my friend between 4 and 5, and between 5 and 6 I don't love him anymore, and then at 7 again I begin. So we speak here of a sphere of acts that exist in the person in a superactual way, exist really in the person, but not only when they are actually performed or when they are actually lived or experienced. And Hildebrand thinks that this is a crucial point for the understanding of the person, that the life of the person is not reduced to the constantly changing actual experiences. But the virtue is not only superactual, because also concrete responses like love to a particular individual person is superactual, but virtues are general, are somehow referring to a whole sphere of values or of goods. We could also say virtues can refer also to objective goods for a person. Hildebrand does not explicitly speak of that, but speaks of superactual value responses. But if one takes into account his chapter on the moral significance of the objective good for persons, and of his chapter 7 of his book on the nature of love, where he speaks of the interest we take in love in the objective good of another person, then I think one can say that virtues can not only refer to intrinsic values, but also to objective goods for one's own and for one other person. For one's own, for example, despair is a very bad evil attitude, moral evil, and it refers to the objective good of our own person. We abandon the confident hope that we will receive that good, or, for example, neglect of our health or other neglect of our life, or risking quite irrationally our life in the traffic on the street and so on. All these are are either vices or virtues that refer to objective goods for the person. And then and these virtues or vices have, we could say, have a whole sphere of values or objective goods for persons as object. They are not just a response to this particular good here and now, but to a whole species or a whole genus of goods. And But these virtues are what some philosophers call categorical. That is, they refer to a specific sphere of goods. For example, justice to all that pertains to the rights and claims and to the whole sphere of just and unjust actions. Purity that refers to another sphere of values, or the virtue of honesty still to another, or the virtue of love of truth or truthfulness still to another sphere of values of goods. So these virtues are general, but not totally general. They refer to a whole specific, particular kind of goods. And the fourth level, the most foundational level, is what Hildebrand in his early philosophy calls the fundamental moral attitude. And there he distinguished a fundamental moral stance that is sort of inevitably given in each person, but must not yet be appropriated, must not be yet super-actual, must not yet be deeply rooted in the person. And the morally good attitude, fundamental attitude, which is, so to speak, the general will to be good, or a universal response to all moral values and morally relevant values or morally relevant objective goods for persons and so on. So we can say this would be the most universal stance, some kind of fundamental will to the good or will to be evil, like Richard III. I am willed to become a villain. This famous monologue in which he gives a kind of diabolical, fundamental moral attitude. So we can say that between these different spheres of moral acts, there are many, well, still another thing. In order to be a moral virtue, it's not enough to be a super-actual response to a whole sphere of goods, but it has to be to a sphere of goods that are morally relevant. Hildebrand distinguishes in his ethics goods that are not morally relevant, like, for example, the brilliance of a chess game. If somebody is interested in chess, as I am, that's not morally good. It's, I hope, also not morally evil by a waste of time, but it is not morally good. And if somebody admires Kasparov's party number so-and-so, then that's not morally good. And if somebody has no interest in chess, it's not morally evil. So there are other goods and evils which are morally relevant. So if somebody says, I have no interest in the well-being of my children, I neglect them, I lock them up, I will not give them an education, then that's not like I'm not interested in chess. That's a morally a bad attitude. So we can say that the different, maybe the new contribution of Hildebrand to the philosophy of virtue is not only to distinguish these four different layers or spheres of moral acts, but also to see the nature of virtues not just as inclinations to actions. In the past, or in Aristotle, who compares virtues with the habits of a player of a musical instrument, he more seems to think that a particular ability and inclination to certain kinds of acts is virtue. So they are somehow geared towards actions. In Hildebrand, they are a sphere of their own. The virtues and vices are not just important in relationship to actions, but they have their own and very central role in the moral life of the person. And also they in a certain way, do not only arise, according to Hildebrand, from repeated actions, from repeated good actions. Of course, repeated good actions, if I have daily occasion to have in Venezuela in contact with the poor who almost die of hunger, and I daily give them something to eat and occupy, then the virtue of generosity, of charity will certainly more easily grow through the repeated good actions. But these virtues and vices, according to Hildebrand, can also arise from the inner responses when they become superactual. So they are not just the consequence of repeated actions of a certain kind. And of course also the vices. The negative acts, so for example, the diabolical envy and hatred of God is certainly not not only the fruit of repeated evil actions. It's rather the root of these evil actions, and it is, we can say, is a stance, a general and universal stance towards towards the divine good. So these are some reflections, and maybe Hildebrand very much emphasizes the unity of the moral sphere between the virtues and the fundamental moral attitude and the concrete actions. That plays a particularly important role in the notion of intrinsically evil acts, a question that recently arose with the four cardinals asking the Pope about Amoris Laetitia, and with there's many so-called proportionalist ethicists and moral theologians who try to claim that the fundamental moral attitude, or as they say, the fundamental moral option, if it is good, is compatible with all kinds of actions, when the totality of their consequences seem to be better than the consequences of an opposite action. So if you think that abortion, for example, is in a particular situation better than having the child, because if you have the child, maybe the husband will desert the wife, maybe he will kill the other children, maybe he will whatever do, then I can commit it. Or for example, euthanasia or many other such actions. And Hildebrand's ethics, I think, implies that there's a deep inner unity between these universal virtues and fundamental moral attitude and the concrete actions. And not all concrete actions and types of actions are compatible with the positive moral attitude. And therefore, the actions as well stand under the same principle that they should be adequate and appropriate to their objects as virtues. You cannot simply determine the moral quality of an action by the consequences by the sum of its consequences, but you have to look at the inner end or purpose of the action, and then you can see in many cases that these actions like calumny, lie, murder, abortion, euthanasia, well, many others, are by their nature evil, and you cannot claim that in some situations they can be justified in view of the consequences. So why is that? Because the whole moral sphere, according to Hildebrand, summarizes the same principle, the principle of adequacy to the morally relevant goods and objects, and therefore a personal action cannot be considered functionally in a purely utilitarian way as bringing about certain results. But as a personal act, it implies a certain stance towards some goods, and it can be positive or negative. Well, this is only... do you have more time?
Well, we have time for discussion.
You have time for discussion.
Yes.
Okay, then that means you have no more time. But the people have time.
Well, you will have time in the form of their questions, but thank you.
I see.
you like to stand there? So, I'd like to take all of your questions. I thought I would raise one question that I find myself thinking about in reading von Hildebrand's Ethics, which is his assertion that the virtues cannot just be reduced to various forms of potentiality, like the possibility of doing something or an ability, like playing a musical instrument. But I wonder, in the spirit of trying to identify the really irreducible quality that is virtue, what if someone were to say, but in the end, what virtue really means is that someone will consistently act in a certain way, and unless I experience that acting, that consistent action, the fact that my father will always be generous to me and has not actually contributed to theories of torture, but that he will be consistent. In other words, it's the consistency of action that perhaps many would see. And I don't think von Hildebrand would deny that. You wouldn't deny that. But if one had to really sort of locate the virtue as irreducible to that possibility, how would you answer that? And I'm taking for granted even that things like the expression, for example, someone who is truly transformed by good actions would perhaps express kindness and benevolence. And I don't take that to be insignificant, but one could still argue that those are sort of all external expressions, or not necessarily that irreducible thing that virtue is. That virtue in the end is just the possibility for action or even for inner responses.
Well, that's already two different things. But I think if you, for example, consider what the New Testament and the Old Testament regard as the supreme virtue, namely the love of God and the love of neighbor, then Hildebrand would certainly say, and I think he's right in saying, that this love is an inner act responding to God or to all neighbors, that is a response that is in no way reducible to doing this and that particular action. Rather, from this super-actual and general attitude of love, many actions flow, but they are not. But the virtue is the love of God or of neighbor is not simply reducible to the concrete benevolent actions, like your father's kind actions towards you, and that he never tortured you. That is a consequence of the virtue of his love of neighbor and love of God and of his his justice, that when you did not act badly, he would not punish you. So these good actions of your father are the consequence. They flow somehow from his virtues, but his virtues are not simply his good actions towards you. You can see that also because the same virtues do not just give rise to good actions towards you, but towards many kind actions towards me. For example, the patient way in which he accepted you are making him my slave during the days of the symposium. And when he comes every day and cooks eggs and washes dishes, that's all another manifestation, a series of good actions that flow from the same virtues from which you profit so much. But his virtue is not reducible to all these actions, because his virtues will also manifest themselves in many other relations to many other persons.
Would it be correct to say that without von Hildebrand's understanding of superactual acts and responses, that it would be more difficult to, I mean, that's key to his account of the way in which virtue is not just the potential for acts and actions?
Yeah. This notion of superactual acts, I think, is key, and this does not allow to call the superactual act simply potencies or simply inclinations or simply habits that make you easily do certain action, but they are themselves superactual stances and positions taken by the person. And I think one could also include in the discussion of virtue an application of a very important distinction Hildebrand makes in his second earliest work, the Morality and Ethical Value Knowledge, in which he distinguishes 7 kinds of depths which an act can have in the person. And one of these centers of depths is the superactuality. But there are many others, like what he calls the specific depths, that certain kinds of acts, like playing a game, are not as deep as, for example, justice or whatever. And then he distinguishes the qualitative depths. So somebody can act justly but have a much less profound virtue of justice than another, much less refined, more rudimentary justice. Mm-hmm. And then you can have the rootedness of the person, how deeply and how really an act is rooted. So for a virtue, it is not only required that it is superactual, but that it is deeply rooted in the person, so that not at the first moment one is tempted, one again goes away, like Pinocchio, who has the best attitude to go to school and to obey his father, but as soon as he sees the theater, he forgets all his good purpose and runs after. So we can say this real rootedness in the person, or many other forms of depth. So it's a more complex question.
Yes, yes.
But all of these, I think, show that the virtue is not simply a disposition to act or a potency to act or an inclination to act, mm-hmm. to actions, but something on its own, and much deeply existing in the person.
Right.
Can I comment here, John Henry? Sure. So Scotus, his understanding of that affection for justice is the innate liberty or the innate freedom of the will, and he follows Anselm's definition, which is it's an inclination to preserve justice for the sake of justice. And so the poem that says the just man justice keeps grace. So being virtuous in this ultimate sense isn't a matter of doing certain sorts of actions that fall under a certain category, but it's a matter of keeping what you were given in the very beginning. So Adam had this right before he fell, but then he fell. So if he would have just done whatever, if he would have loved God, then he could have just done what Augustine said, love God and do what you will. It doesn't matter particular types of action, right? Because you're doing everything for the sake of God. So it seems like that's one way to understand it, not as a sort of disposition, a certain kind of tendency that's an inclination, but it is a kind of thing that's innate to the will. He calls it an affection, right, or a pondus, like a tendency. But the will itself is an active power, active potency, and doesn't have. It itself has this quality in it, and we just need to keep it there.
Yeah, I think you remarked that there's a deep connection between the Franciscan tradition and Hildebrand in no way understood it in this terrible way to see Scotus as destroyer and of anthropology and of everything, but rather he had deep relationship, and Father Alan Walter, the great uncle of my son-in-law, Tom Walter, he spoke with Hildebrand in Washington, I think, about Duns Scotus, and told Hildebrand that the affectio justitia and many other elements in Duns Scotus are just very similar to Hildebrand's ethics of value response. And Hildebrand came back from this visit on Duns Scotus and all enthusiastic and always pointed out his deep affinity to the ethics of Scotus. And that I think is. I didn't. May I ask you a question? You seem to say that Scotus says that the intellect is not a rational faculty, but only the will.
It's not a rational power.
But well, I think that both are. Yeah. He has this hierarchy. He had this whole comparison between intellect and will. And he opposes the hierarchy of Thomas Aquinas and of Aristotle, that the intellect is the highest rational faculty, And he says, no, it's the will, and he gives some good arguments. For example, that the will makes good acts of the will make the person herself good, but acts of intellect not. And so since the moral goodness of the person is the highest value of the person, that faculty which, when it is used in accordance with truth and the good, will make the person herself good, must be higher than the intellect that doesn't have this immediate deep effect on the person per se. And so it gives other arguments. Some of them are very beautifully contained in a movie you should all buy. It's all available on DVD. It's called Scotus. And it is an excellent movie where some of the philosophical and some of the theological insights and biographical elements of Scotus are mixed. And it culminates in his big debate in Paris where he defends the Immaculate Conception that you have on this painting, and against the Thomists, and he gloriously defends it with excellent reason. So he was Dr. Subtilis and Marianus. Yeah. So I am very happy that you praised Duns Scotus.